Hello, my name is Ethan Lane. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, representing cattle producers from coast to coast in all segments of the supply chain. Welcome to today's panel, the Cattlemen's Land Trusts at the forefront of conservation. We're really lucky today to have a fantastic panel of producers and experts from throughout the industry that are going to talk a bit about their efforts in conservation in the ranching community, some of the tools that are at the forefront today, and some of what's on the horizon as far as putting more conservation on the ground while ensuring that the industry stays economically viable into the future. We'll get started by introducing today's panelists. We'll start with Rick Knight.
Thanks, Ethan. Yeah, I'm Rick Knight, a professor of wildlife conservation at Colorado State. I'm a proud member of the Colorado Cattlemen's Association, vice president of conservation for the Colorado Cattlemen's Agricultural Land Trust, and I'm a board member and secretary of the Partnership of Rangeland Trusts, and those are state ag land trusts across the American West. Thank you.
Next is Gary Price.
Okay, I'm Gary Price. We ranch south of Dallas, about 50 miles, and we've put the ranch together over the last 45 years. We have a cow-calf operation. We market all of our cattle as all naturals, and we are in the Blackland Prairie ecoregion of the state, which is the most threatened ecoregion in North America. So we manage for mainly native grasses, and it's family operation. Our son will come back here someday and take over.
Hello, my name is Terry Fankhouser. I'm the Executive Vice President with the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. I also serve on the Cattlemen's Association Land Trust Board. We're also the founders of a group called Partners for Western Conservation that's been working on payment for ecosystem services for years. My family and I operate a cow-calf operation in the Flint Hills of Kansas, as well as some interest in livestock in Colorado and Wyoming. I've been with the association for 20 years. Our focus not only is representing beef producers throughout Colorado, but also working to steward the resources that these beef producers depend on a daily basis.
Hello, everyone. I'm Meredith Ellis. I'm a second-generation rancher in North Texas. My family and I manage 3,000 acres of pristine ranch land. We're members of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We're also part of the Noble Research Institute's Land Stewardship Program, which is a pilot for the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. And we're also members of the Integrity Beef Alliance. Thanks for having me.
Hello, my name's Rich Winkler. I'm the Executive Director of the Malpais Borderlands Group. We're a 501c3 nonprofit that's been working since 1994. We work in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico with a collaborative of ranchers looking to continue pastoral ranching and traditional livelihoods while protecting the land from fragmentation.
So thank you to everybody for joining us today. I want to start out by talking about the idea that, I think everyone on this panel has probably said and heard in the industry for years that ranchers are the original conservationists. For generations, we have been the ones managing these resources and ensuring that the habitat and ecosystems that we're all preserving today are in the shape that they are in and able to continue that legacy into the future. But I think it's also fair to say that the panelists that are joining us today are at the forefront of what's possible in that arena. These are folks that are really pioneering the technologies and the practices that are going to lead us into the next century in ranching and conservation. With that, I'm curious to hear from the panelists, how are you approaching land management on your operations today? What are some of the key tools and resources that you're starting to integrate into providing those ecosystem services and habitat benefits, and what's working for you on your operations? Rick, we'll start with you.
Well, possibly since my wife and I don't have a working cattle ranch. We do lease our grass and our water to a neighbor who is 100% rancher. But what I could speak about possibly, if this works for you, Ethan, is this concept of a conservation easement. There might be some of your listeners that aren't familiar with that. A conservation easement is voluntary and it's legal, and it limits the use of land in order to protect its conservation values. And it's nice to say conservation values have been broadly defined, including historical values, even scenic values, educational values, as well as, importantly, ag and natural resource values. The landowner still owns their land, and they can sell the land at any time for whatever the market can actually bear. It's important to know that conservation easements are flexible and tailored to meet the landowner's needs and desires. I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. There's over 1,300 different land trusts. So the key thing is obviously to find a land trust whose objective goals and objectives align with the landowners. And of course, it's so important to appreciate that this is a voluntary thing. It's something that the landowner's family has to go through, has to discuss and explore every little detail to make sure it's going to work for the family as well as the family ranch. And one last thing there, Ethan, the actual value, the economic value of a conservation easement, up until now, it's starting to change just a little bit because of some of the pioneering work of people like Terry Fankhouser. But right now, the value of a conservation easement is determined by a qualified appraiser. And the way that's done, the appraiser determines that the value of the land being developed in its highest and best use. So that's usually a residential or a commercial use. So what that value of that land would be not protected, minus the value of that land once those developable values have been removed from it. So in other words, once the conservation easement is on it and it's curtailed, the residential and commercial values or energy development values, that's the conservation value. And that's where the sort of trying to recoup some of that lost value in perpetuity comes into play.
And Rick, following up on that, you know, in our industry, as you know, we're always having two different conversations at once. One within our industry talking about the benefits of a tool like this, and then a second one with consumers, with our retail partners, and with the public at large that generally don't understand how we bring beef from gate to plate, so to speak, and get it into their grocery stores. And I'm curious how land trusts today are bridging that, because I mean, you spoke to it earlier, some of the values that are protected, whether historic or conservation, those can be a little bit intimidating to an average producer that typically can associate those words with threats to their operation. But by the same token, you know, I've been on a few different ranches just in the last few months where you have encroaching development coming from larger metropolitan areas. You have the need to protect those resources and communicate to the public that those large unbroken landscapes that are preserved are critical to conservation. How do you bridge those two different messages from a land trust perspective and ensure that you're assuaging producer concerns on one end, but communicating value and benefit to the public at large on another?
Sure enough. So this is a challenge. And as everybody on this panel so fully appreciates, this distance, this chasm between rural and urban people widens with every increasing year. And unfortunately, the burden, the responsibility falls on the private landowner and the land trusts that hold easements of important ag lands that are conserved with conservation easements. I think we're doing a better job. There's this partnership of rangeland trusts. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It includes Texas. It's this partnership of 10 land trusts covering 10, 11, 12 Western states. We just actually voted on South Dakota State Ag Land Trust joining our partnership of rangeland trusts Monday. Today's Wednesday. So now it's 11 Western, it's 12 Western states that are part of this. Those statewide agricultural land trusts, in association with their statewide Cattlemen's Association, have an incredible amount of clout. They presently hold, if you can believe this, over 1,500 conservation easements, protecting, starting to approach 3 million acres. All of those landowners are trying to articulate, it's not just the food that's coming off of these stewarded lands, it's also all these ecosystem services, as well as the scenic values, the educational values, the historical values. But these, every one of these ranch families across the western states of America are spokespeople. And every time they have an interaction with anybody from this ever increasing urban public, they have an opportunity to share with the public. It's not only food that's coming off these conserved lands, it's sequestering greenhouse gases, carbon in the soil. It's producing critical wildlife habitat as suitable wildlife habitat is increasingly shrinking. It's giving you those scenic views where you can at least temporarily escape the high pressure in these urbanizing environments where you drive at ever increasing speeds through ever increasingly congested landscapes. And then all of a sudden you hit a working cattle ranch, a piece of conserved open space. So it's a challenge. I mean, it's actually a welcome challenge, because when you think of what ranchers are doing, farm and ranch families are doing across America and across the American West, it's noble work to try to explain that you're not only producing food for an ever increasing public, but you're also tying down all these natural resource and scenic values forever. And that story alone, you think about, there are still families in America that view ag as a hallowed calling and are willing to give everything. In a sense, when they put that conservation easement on the ranch, they're sort of managing that ranch from the grave. I mean, that's going to go on to their children and their children's children.
Right. Rick, you mentioned carbon sequestration, and I think that's a topic that's worth exploring here. I want to bring Meredith Ellis into the conversation. Meredith, you've been doing some work on that subject on your ranch, and obviously with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, we've all been working for some ways to really quantify the benefit we're already putting on the ground. Can you talk a little bit about what you've been doing on your operation and what you're discovering?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, on our 3,000 acres, we conserve 9 major ecological sites, including 1,000 acres of ancient forest land. We are a refuge for threatened and endangered species, a resting place for migratory ones. And thanks to the efforts and the large financial investment from the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium, we are now able to take into account our net carbon footprint from our beef operation. And right now, that initial modeling is showing that we are sequestering 2,000 plus tons of CO2 annually. So that's like taking over 500 cars off the road every single year. And I'm really proud of that. But on top of that, the ESMC is also developing a way to quantify the value of the biodiversity on our ranch from a habitat preservation mindset. Just to help you understand the gravity of this situation. So our ranch is in Texas. Recently, the Texas Observer came out with an article that says less than 1% of the native Texas grasslands remain intact. Less than 1%. Nationally, that number is around 4%. The Smithsonian Magazine last month came out with an article that said in the past 50 years, humans have managed to wipe out 2/3 of the world's wildlife population. So I can't express to you the importance of valuing these private national parks more. What I need as a rancher is, you know, follow that path of the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium. I want to know what future decisions I make on my operation, how that affects my carbon sequestration rate. I want to know if I'm grazing in a timely manner to encourage the most natural species of biodiversity that I possibly can. So I encourage equipping ranchers with the knowledge and the technology and the assistance to be able to just make some real educated decisions on their ecosystem values that they're adding. And I really believe that that ESMC market is well on its way to giving me the knowledge and the scientific answers that I'm looking for to help me do that into the future.
Gary, I know you're involved with the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium as well. I'm curious, I mean, you've been involved in policy conversations for quite some time. I know you've been back to Washington talking about these issues. And I know you understand as well as anybody the challenge that we're all trying to meet here with structures like the Ecosystem Services Consortium. There's always been challenges with the demand side of that equation. I think producers, whether through conservation easements or things like this, are willing to step up and do the work, but making sure that that translates to a benefit throughout the supply chain while we have retail partners, McDonald's, Burger King, grocery stores that are looking to tell their consumers about the work that we're doing on ranch and on farm. That's been a big part of this. Can you talk a little bit about some of those efforts and about some of the work that's been done on ecosystem service credits and I mean some of the challenges that we've faced in that regard?
Yes, Ethan, very good question. You know, we do a lot in ranching, as already been mentioned. Meredith touched on it as well, that we do so much that benefits so many other folks. And we're doing good things. We have a buyer for those good products that we're producing. So we hope to go to market with the first purchases in 2022. We'll be announcing some of the first purchases of those credits as early as 2021, but the market will be open and ready to go, we hope, by 2022. But outstanding opportunity for all of agriculture to finally be rewarded for a lot of these good ecosystem services that we do provide. And really the climate has never been better for this. People want to know where their food comes from. They especially want to know where their beef comes from, how it was produced. So what a great time for us to be able to tell this story. And the rewards will be good. It'll be, again, strictly voluntary, but it will incentivize other producers to even do more good conservation on the land.
Well, and what an opportunity to have a driving seat, have the driver's seat in this conversation from the industry so that we can offer a quantifiable alternative to, say, the Burger King lemongrass debacle from earlier this year, where, you know, they're chasing maybe questionable science with hopefully good intent, but without the knowledge to really deliver on something that we know has real benefit. And with that in mind, Richard, I want to bring you into the conversation. You know, as an Arizona kid, especially with my father having been the state land commissioner in Arizona back in the early 80s, I've been hearing about the Malpais Borderlands group my whole life. You know, you guys have really taken on some conversations and brought partners to the table that I think rightfully so we tend to get a little concerned about in the ranching industry. But you know, it's impossible to have some of these conversations without engaging some of those folks that don't necessarily see the world the same way as us, and try to find some common ground. Can you talk about some of the work you've done down there, and the successes, and maybe some of the existing challenges with that process, and what you see in the future?
Thank you. You're correct. In the early 90s, while many organizations and individual ranchers were looking to solve problems individually, the Malpais Borderlands group looked allies to others to solve problems externally with other partners. Since 1994, we've been engaged as an active land trust since 1994, and you were correct that there was a lot of angst and a lot of turmoil in terms of how to solve these problems. And what we did was to try to look not only to each other, but to outside resources, to work with state and federal agencies in a collaborative manner to try to solve some of these problems. My family's been since 1970 in the valley, San Bernardino Valley in southwestern New Mexico. The Malpais Borderlands group is in southeastern Arizona and southwestern New Mexico, as along the border with 2 states in Mexico. And fragmented to continue our traditional livelihoods of pastoral ranching. This is continued today in part by land conservation easements, preventing land fragmentation, and working with others. We've been successful at a variety of programs, namely one is placing fire as a natural part of the ecosystem back into our working area for range management, as well as having a more natural fire regime in these areas with some collaborative efforts with state and federal agencies, local district forest rangers, BLM agencies in 2 states was difficult to get off the ground. But it was something that we worked toward, has been very successful in the last 26 years. And currently we've been looking at working with the Jornada experimental range in Las Cruces, and being successful at looking at large landscapes and how those landscapes are managed together in a cooperative manner. Those are challenging. This is challenging, especially as the climate right now is in a terrible drought. Fluctuating cattle markets make things more and more difficult. We have to continue to work toward some of these ecological goals, as well as range management goals for people who are moving cattle, and their families rely on the beef industry and their cattle ranches to sustain them. One thing that I think that we have been very successful at is providing an opportunity together in reaching out to a variety of partners and listening to what common goals we have together. And that has been always the basis of that, of our origins. And some of those efforts have been worked out in terms of not only private ranchers placing and protecting their ranch from subdivision, as subdivisions were growing in the late 80s. And we could see that that was a threat to pastoral ranching, but also in protecting, because a lot of these ranches have BLM leases and Forest Service allotments attached to them. So by protecting the private land also was extended by those leases that are contiguous with the private lands there.
Well, and we could have a whole nother panel on the limitations of implementing those same private land conservation practices on your adjacent federal grazing permits, but we'll save that one for another day. But Terry, I want to bring you in. We've been talking a lot about the benefits and a lot about kind of the great things that folks are working on, but you in Colorado are at the forefront of a lot of, I feel like the pitfalls of this, in that we tend to get focused on single species management on a lot of these areas, because a species becomes the issue of the day, whether that be sage grouse, whether that be the lesser prairie chicken, wolves, you name it. That always ends up sort of being a stumbling block, I think, for a lot of our producers who are managing for landscape scale conservation for the benefit of multiple species. Nowhere that I'm aware of are you kind of feeling the force of that, maybe other than California more directly than in Colorado. Can you talk a little bit about those challenges and what your organization, your producers are doing to engage in that?
Thanks, Ethan. You and I used to be a lot younger and a lot more handsome before we got into some of those policy discussions like this. There's several ways to lead on that issue and that question, and one of those is that we can fight as agriculture and try to prove our point that way. The other way is that we lead by example. There's no doubt when we look at the ecosystems that species rely on that we have to fully consider agriculture. I mean, our membership base in Colorado is approximately 70% of the private lands, the state lands, and the federal lands in this state. You will not recover a species or conserve a species without agriculture. And that's the same in the majority of the states in this union. So agriculture learns at a very early age, and in fact, in my family, I always say my parents had two biological children, and then the one that really mattered, and that was the ranch. And we were taught that stewardship, that culture, that loyalty at a very young age, and we always understood that what we put in it is what we get out of it. What agriculture has not done very well, and I think as we think about species management, agriculture has not really brought the wealth of generations of knowledge and management forward in a way that is interpretive and understood by the public. It's kind of like a recipe that you all know, and you just grab a handful of things and throw it in, and it turns out well time and time again. There are certain people that can do that. Agriculture can do that with land management, but we have to be much more articulate and outcome-based and verifiable in our actions. So specifically to the point that you brought up about single species management, I think that's some of the challenges that we get caught in as we look at the Endangered Species Act, as we look at NEPA, all of these fun acronyms that we all understand in agriculture. But really, it brings me back to kind of words of the day. One of the things that we hear a lot about is biodiversity. I spoke about biodiversity recently, and I used the term balance. And I actually was criticized fairly heavily in this conservation panel for using the terminology balance when I talk about biodiversity. I don't know any other way to think about biodiversity than balancing the different interests and demands on the land and the resources for the betterment of an ecological system that also includes humans. We have to consider humans in all of these equations as well. So agriculture, I think, understands this. We understand balance. We understand landscape level conservation. What we need to do is to partner with academic institutions, ecosystem service markets, land trusts, and policymakers, and our state and national organizations to be able to put that in terms that's both meaningful to our consumers, but also meaningful to citizens at large in the scientific community. To me, that's an easy, actionable step, and I see a lot more movement than just in Colorado and California and Texas. This is really a renaissance for conservation, I think, in agriculture. What we have to figure out how to do, though, is to move that forward. And for instance, we've been working on ecosystem services for over a decade. and we've moved millimeters. We really need, if we care about these species, to move at a much more rapid pace sooner than later. So I appreciate the question. I think it's something we can talk about for a long time, but that's how I come at the discussion, both with a policy and conservation hat on.
I appreciate that. I want to engage the whole panel. Richard said something I want to come back to, and I would be remiss moderating a panel like this in 2020 without acknowledging the fact that our producers have been dealing with some of the most tremendous market shocks and price fluctuations in the history of the cattle business this year. And you have a lot of our producers that are looking at a discussion like this and saying, I'm just hoping I get enough money for my calves to stay in business this year. How can I be expected to be focusing on some of these other issues and what seems like maybe a little bit more of a self-indulgent conversation about conservation? I think everyone on this panel would agree we don't have the luxury of ignoring this part of the equation, even in a tough price environment. But can producers not just preserve what they have, regardless of market conditions, by implementing conservation practices, but can they thrive? Can they economically thrive? Because I think there's a difference between the perspective of some who might look at this and say, we'll create enough space for you to implement these practices and hold on. That's not going to work for producers across the country. Can they do this and experience economic growth and benefit and prosperity? I'll go around the horn, but Rick, I'll start with you.
Well, everything Terry said got me thinking about this, once more. So our form of economy is capitalism. And what we need to do, and I think all the panel members here are actively engaged in this, and so many other people across the American West, we need to start putting cogs and wheels into the economic juggernaut of capitalism, which works so well, to give those advantages to these private landowners who are trying to make a living right now off of a single commodity, and it's usually livestock. And so what, as Terry said, we need these active dynamic partnerships of academics, entrepreneurs, these private landowners that support statewide ag land trusts, to come up with payment for ecosystem services programs, and the sooner the better. One thing that I found very interesting when the state of California did their carbon tax credit law, which I guess is now 2 years ago, I may be a year off on that, 50% of those carbon credits can be purchased outside of California. And the more states we have that somehow or another, we have to get this blend of private public partnerships and develop these payment for ecosystem services programs. They are starting, and Terry's right. We've been talking about it for 20 years. It's almost like it's been an academic topic, but that entrepreneurship that is inherent seemingly in most Americans, the ability to develop a marketplace, the way we've already done for things like cars to coffee. We need to really encourage that. And if it requires some economic incentives at the beginning, so be it. But once those things are unleashed, we are going to see in 10 years' time payment for ecosystem service marketplaces for every one of those additional commodities that private landowners tie down and are not compensated for, but are absolutely essential to the happiness and health of all Americans.
Meredith, I'm curious about your perspective as a young producer in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from my perspective, it's pretty insane for me to want to enter into this line of work. It's high risk, it's low reward, it's backbreaking. I don't get a day off. And then there's like a lot of negative press about the beef industry and how horrible I am for the environment. So it's just a really thankless job. What is stopping me from selling my land for millions of dollars, never having to worry about anything financial for the rest of my life, Quite frankly, I could not look at myself in the mirror knowing that all of those species, that 1% of rangeland left in my state, was being paved over for a development, and be able to look at my 6-year-old in the eyes and say that I did a good thing for his future, because that is not a good thing. So it is a labor of love. It is a passion and a conviction that I am here, and I see the potential of private landowners to really be the answer to the climate solution. And I think the honest to God way forward is to make these ranchers aware that their nutritious, high protein beef is not their main product. Their main product is carbon. Their main product is water quality. Their main product is habitat preservation. Those need to be just as familiar products to the common rancher as market beef is. And I think if we make that a commonality across the board, that it will have that financial motivation for people that, like me, that want to continue. This is not just a day job. This is my family's heritage, my future, my identity, and I am very not alone in that conviction. All of us ranchers feel that way, and we would love an answer to help us hang on to this land. And I believe adding those products to our portfolio that we provide this planet is the way forward.
Gary, I'm curious about your perspective on that as well. Especially given your proximity to Dallas, and the idea that you're putting some of the best conservation benefit in the world on your land, like everyone on this meeting is. But how do you make sure your neighbor knows what we're doing, and how do you make sure that that everyone really is understanding that benefit?
Sure. Well, we're going to manage this way anyway. We've discovered, that water really drives the ranch, and finally dawned on me I'm not going to be able to make it rain, so I need to conserve every drop of water I get. And it took a while to learn that, but grass is what drives the ranch, and water is what drives the grass. But if I can be incentivized to do more, many producers know what to do. They know what conservation practices they would like to implement, whether it's brush control or replanting some old fields into a native grass, but they're held back by the economics of that. So if we can incentivize those producers to do more quicker, then we can get there a lot quicker. Obviously, we're just at a great time where consumers, again, as I mentioned earlier, they want to know where their food comes from, how that producer was taking care of the land. So it's a matter really of connecting the dots. We've got corporations now that are being driven, as I mentioned earlier, not only by their consumers in many instances, but also the stockholders. So it's connecting those dots. This is going to happen. It's great for agriculture, great opportunity to, again, be rewarded for those good conservation practices that we're doing. This thing has really evolved. It started with carbon, but as we know, we grow a lot of grass and we sequester a lot of carbon. We know we also do a lot for water conservation. We recharge those aquifers. We lessen soil erosion because we're growing more grass, and there's no greater filter for water than grass. And as we're growing more grass, then we're creating more wildlife habitat. And to bridge that gap to those urban consumers, not only to the consumers, but also the representatives in Congress and in state legislatures that represent them, we've got to get that message across to them. The bottom line, we're all in this together. And as Terry had mentioned earlier, all of these species are going to rely on private lands to go forward. So I think we're at a great crossroads of bringing all these pieces together. obviously, that grass needs the cow to be productive for those ecosystems to work, to be functional, and for those water systems to work. So, yeah, just very excited about where we are as a country, bringing all these pieces together. As the consumers want to know where their food comes from, how it's produced, and then also that to have somebody that needs what you produce. So as Meredith said, we're not just producing cattle, we're producing cleaner air, we're producing cleaner water, we're recharging the aquifers, and we're taking care of these, many times these prairies that are very, very threatened. As I mentioned earlier, we're in the Blackland ecosystem, Blackland Prairie ecosystem in Texas. It's the most threatened ecosystem in North America. Less than 1% of it was never plowed. We're fortunate to have several hundred acres of that on the ranch, and to be able to see those systems work and the ability of those systems to work when we're in extreme drought is pretty amazing. That those plants can still grow with 12 or 14-inch root systems. We've been very fortunate to work with McDonald's through the flagship farmer program over the last 18 months. And I've gotten to visit their headquarters in Chicago and learn a little bit more about their operation. And they've actually brought all of their senior leadership team to the ranch about 12 months ago. We had a good ranch tour, a great day.
Richard, I want to bring you back into the conversation, teeing off of some of what Gary said. You know, as the head lobbyist for the cattlemen, obviously we have a lot of frustrating interactions with the environmental community, and I know they wrestle with everybody from groups that are excited to work with ranchers to those that don't believe ranchers should be on the landscape at all. And getting back to that economic viability piece, can we get there with the bulk of the environmental community, because their megaphone is so much bigger than ours, especially with some of those supply chain partners like a McDonald's? Can we get to a point where you have these larger environmental groups truly extolling the values of what we're doing and working alongside us for that economic prosperity as well?
I think two thoughts. One is, yes, you can, but you have to focus on what you have in common in terms of what those common goals are. And two, having working partners that provide science that support those commonalities. I think that's important. Once you have those two things, in focusing on the goals that both the environmental community, ranchers, and others have in common, I think that's the starting point. I just want to touch on one thing that Meredith said that I really hit home with me in terms of we have been looking at generational transition of ranches, and I was raised not only just in the Malpais Borderlands group on the land there, but also within the organization. And I think that the new generation that Meredith was talking about, as some of these ranches have transitioned 2, 3, 4, 5 times in 5-generation ranches. My kids will be the 3rd generation to run the ranch, looking for economic viability in ranching and understanding that what some of the panelists have already brought up, that this unfragmented landscape is one of the most important drivers for saving a number of species. We are one of 9 major grasslands also in the world, and looking at from that perspective, you feel like that you are acting locally, but it is a global issue in terms of saving some of these grasslands. And having 2nd generation, and you're wondering, what am I doing some days, as Meredith pointed out, that this is a tough go. And these economic factors can drive next generations off the land. And keeping those people on the land is one of the factors that is important, and the common goals that go along with some of these things that are contentious. is where to start. But you can never reverse the gears and reverse on a ranch being fragmented, and you can't reverse that. That would be very difficult to do. And so you get a one-time shot here. We're very lucky that the founders of the Malpais Borderlands group were able to see that keeping people on land and looking at those common goals were one of the most important factors in what we call a working wilderness. Coined the term, Bill McDonald coined the term radical center, working from that radical center to get different viewpoints and then think about that in generations. It's a game of inches, right? And but year after year, small strides make up large areas that are protected, and that's what we've been aiming to do from our inception. And I think we're going to continue that, but it has to involve this generational transition of thought process of how you go forward with that. And I think we're doing that, although, as Meredith mentioned, it's very difficult at times. The skill set needed from different generations is learned not in a year or two. It's taken a lifetime of learning from some of the generations before us about how to manage some of these areas with what Gary said. Water in our desert grassland is very important, and saving those water sources and managing each ranch individually and getting the knowledge that comes from a rancher who's been there 3 or 4 generations is invaluable, and working with others to gather data to support those thoughts and those ideas is where you start.
Thank you, Terry. You and I spend probably a larger amount of our lives than we're willing to admit trying to keep the federal government and other regulatory bodies out of the cattle business. And it is a full-time job. But it does beg the question, with the conversation we've been having today, does the government play a role or need to play a role in valuing the practices that producers are putting on the landscape?
I think there's a variety of ways that the government has a role in this. I come from the school of thought that there's probably adequate resources to reach the desired goals and objectives that we need related to natural resources. It's just a matter of the application of those. And I think agriculture needs to step forward fairly resoundingly, whether it's to the federal government, to the NGO community, to the courts even, and say in a very clear and present way that we not only have the resource base to cause meaningful change on a variety of things, but agriculture has always been an entity that can overproduce. So all we have to do is set free and guide and direct agriculture to go out and produce the outcome or the commodity, and frankly, that's what we're talking about here to some extent. It's another form of production in very detailed management of natural resources. So I think the government plays a role, yes. I think that I find it ironic that Fish and Wildlife Service has no dollars to put on the ground, essentially, to conserve species. I find it ironic that the Farm Bill and Natural Resource Conservation Service is now being looked at by everybody in the universe of conservation as a place to go and harvest dollars for their individualized priorities. And in the same time, potentially removing some of those dollars from agriculture's hands where they've met, that program is they're outcome based, but in a programmatic way because we've implemented those conservation practices for so many years. I think we need to be very performance orientated, and I have confidence and faith in agriculture to be able to do the right things for the right reasons at the right time. I believe that agriculture producers have the ability to go out and collectively bring people around them in order to deliver the outcomes that we're all looking for. That we don't need somebody to come in and holistically manage our ranches for us, because we don't have the intellectual depth and ability to do that. I have confidence in agriculture and in agriculture producers. So yes, the government plays a role, NGOs play a role, but what we need to recognize is who's doing the work, who is actually going out and causing change on the ground. Where are those conservation dollars being invested, be it from private entities or federal entities, and what are they getting in return? I can tell you the producers on this panel and the producers I work for, they're not afraid, and my family's not afraid, to be judged based on performance, because we know that we can produce those outcomes. So it's a bit broader question than you asked me, Ethan, but I think it is the point of the spear and where we stand. What we in agriculture need to do is to be able to mature that offering in a way that it's taken seriously, it's meaningful, it's recognizable, and it has broad spectrum support. And then I think the sky's the limit, the gates open, and we move forward in a very, very productive and outcome-based way.
I think we have time for one more question. I want to go around the horn one last time and get you all to give us a brief synopsis of, we all struggle with getting our message out to the public. We all struggle with how to communicate conservation benefit and ranching benefit to the consumers out there. Quickly, what's your top line item that you wish our consumers around the country understood that they don't understand right now? Rick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, clear and simple. Every landowner is the custodian of two goods, his private good as well as the public's good. Now they're compensated for the private good, domestic livestock. What we're not doing right now is compensating them for the public goods. And so in the years to come, we're going to need more of these private-public partnerships to help us develop these payment for ecosystem services programs, because these public goods are being given at no cost to all of Americans. And the sooner we come to the realization of that, the sooner we're going to ensure those public goods continue to come off these private, well-stewarded lands.
Meredith, how about you?
Yeah, so my main message that I would like to communicate to the everyday consumer that's frankly disconnected from where their food comes from is that my land is a private national park. It is just absolutely gorgeous. My dad in the 70s didn't look at this land and say, wow, all this grass and trees is going to sequester so many tons of carbon. It's frankly a good practice of ranching is to respond to nature instead of controlling it, to help mimic the natural flow of cows across the prairie so they can fertilize and inter those native seeds on their way, on their migration across the grasslands. This is a true knowledge that us ranchers have of how to have that balance within the natural ecosystem. So, I just am really thankful for letting my tiny voice be heard today. I'd love to be included in future climate talks. Just to reiterate the gravity of the situation, we recently bought 200 acres of land that had been farmed, and the ground was tilled. And I've had two different experts that I respect very much, one from the Botanical Research Institute of Texas and one from the Noble Research Institute come out, and both of them informed me that restoring that 200 acres to its natural native habitat, I will not see that in my lifetime, and my 6-year-old son will be lucky to see that in his lifetime as well. And so my communication to everyone here today is that we need to act to equip us ranchers with the tools and the knowledge and the markets and the motivation to be able to keep our land intact. I can't express that enough. Let's see. Just one more thing that I'd like to say is that I feel like it is not a big leap to get landowners equipped to where they can provide these environmental benefits. Oftentimes there's some baby steps that make huge impacts. So I feel like this task is not such a monumental task, especially because of the work that like the Ecosystem Services Market Consortium has laid out. Soon I feel that a rancher will be able to say, what happens if I convert this cropland to native pastures? What happens to my carbon credits? What happens to my biodiversity credits? Or they can say, what happens if I add more cows to my herd? What does that do to my land? And those types of tools to inform us ranchers on how to move forward is what we need from the government and what we need from NGOs, because any decision that I'm making, I don't want it to be based on some anecdotal information. I want it to be backed by science and by the experts from these organizations. So I'm just asking for help. And, you know, I just echo Gary's statement that he made earlier, that this is an incredibly exciting time. And I really think that our agriculture is the answer to providing us more nutritious food, more drought and flood resistant land, preserving our habitats, and we're looking at a revolution.
Thank you. Gary, how about your brief closing thoughts on a message for consumers and what you hope they can take away from some of these conversations?
Sure. Again, you know, it all goes back really to working lands and many things that have been mentioned today. Obviously, the ecosystem services that we provide, but you know, what Richard touched on and Terry as well, just the value of generational transfer. I know in Texas, we had a shortage of large animal veterinarians. And so we looked at a way to incentivize young people to become large animal veterinarians. The money was not there. So we did that through maybe helping them through their university and their studies. And I think this is similar to that. If you've got a person, family member that really would like to come back to the ranch or the farm, we should see that as such a valuable asset. And as Meredith mentioned earlier, I mean, there's an economic pull to pull you in a different direction. But if you've got somebody that's so inclined, and we're fortunate, our son runs a ranch north of Fort Worth, and he'll come back here and take over someday. So we're very fortunate there. He loves ranching as much as we do. He wakes up every morning thinking, how can I make this better? And how can I just make the ranch better? And we're very fortunate there. We're all on the same page. But boy, that's quite a resource that we need to treasure in our country. How do we keep that knowledge there? Richard mentioned it so much in his talk that, wow, what a loss it is, you know, when you lose that knowledge, that on the ground experience. These cattle do not manage themselves. you have to have somebody out there making those decisions day by day. So how do we get that knowledge and that need over to the general public? We like to be open and open to, our gates are always open to tours. We're even talking to McDonald's now about the possibility of building a pavilion on the ranch that we could use that for training for NRCS folks. We know in NRCS, many of the new employees have no ag background whatsoever, and they're going to be, conveying some of that technical knowledge on the ground to producers. So our ability to open our gates and be able to be involved with that and bring the public out and see that firsthand. We've even got producers in our own county that have never really seen the ability of some of these native grasses and what they can produce and how those systems can work. So we've got to be open to that and be very transparent in all that we do. And again, I can't emphasize more, and Meredith touched on it. I think we're really at a crossroads. I don't want us to miss the opportunity to bring all of these pieces together, because when we do, it could be a great thing for not only being paid for our product, but also some of the other things that we provide.
Great. Richard, how about your closing thoughts for consumers and the public?
A couple of things. Closing thoughts for what I would want consumers to know is that problem solving takes a number of people, right? And coming to the right number of people to solve a problem. If you have maybe too many people, too many voices, things get lost. And sometimes if you have the right number of people solving the problems, that can be an effective model for all of the things that I've heard here today. A lot of new things that I've learned, but I think that it does take collaboration, and starting with landowners and ranchers as one of those collaborators, I think is needed, because many times has been overlooked. Like as you said, there's a large majority of people that don't even know that they're pastoral ranchers, are willing and can take a lead role in identifying the common goals that a lot of people are asking about. And Gary mentioned that he had given tours, things like that, to let people know what the conservation value is of ranching, and changing that narrative, that we are not only collaborators, but we can be leading the way in these conservation, and what value does that have? I guess that's what I have.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The idea that a consumer should be thinking about the fact that when they buy a McDonald's hamburger, they're making a conservation choice, a positive one, because of how we produce our product. Terry, how do you boil it down to just one? I know you work on this stuff like I do on the policy side. I mean, can you boil it down to one message for the public?
Yeah, I think I can, and ironically, it's the same message that I tell my 3 young children. Be inquisitive. Seek out information and truth. So whether it's the ranching industry about the conservation movement, or consumer opinions, or it's the consumer digesting vast amounts of media that oftentimes is programmed into their social media accounts. Be inquisitive. Always ask questions. Seek out resources so you can get factual answers and information. Open that door. It's not only healthy for you as a producer or a consumer, but it's rewarding. It's enlightening. It's invigorating. Seek out the truth. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank EarthX for giving all of us an opportunity to begin that dialogue and to begin that exploration with venues like this. because it's really an exciting thing when you expose yourself a little bit to be vulnerable and to ask those type of questions, but demand good information. So the same message my children hear repeatedly, I should take as my own medicine, I guess.
Well, I want to thank all of the panelists for joining us today for a conversation that I think really got into some of the challenges and opportunities that we're facing in conservation and ranching in 2020. And I appreciate everyone watching this panel, and I hope this has prompted some dialogue and some questions amongst viewers that maybe they hadn't thought about before, and will cause them, as Terry had said, to seek out more information on these topics. Thank you all for joining us today.